They buried their children alive for 3 generations in the depths of the Vosges forest. There, where the black pines stand like sentinels of silence, a moss-covered stone house hid one of the darkest secrets France has ever known. A whole family, 4 generations, lived by laws that no longer belong to the world of men. Before uncovering what truly happened in that cursed home in 1894, tell me, where are you listening to us from right now? Are you in France, or perhaps somewhere else in the world? Leave a comment so we know how far this story travels across borders. And if you enjoy dark, authentic tales from forgotten history, subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear is only the beginning of a descent into darkness that even time could not erase. The autumn of 1894 had turned the Vosges into a painting of grays and ochres. The villages of Saint-Dié and Gérardmer, nestled in the valleys, were preparing for the harsh winter that would soon roll down from the mountains. In the smoky taverns, lumberjacks and farmers spoke in hushed voices about the hunter Henry Marchand, missing for 8 days in the dense forest north of Fres. Henry was a sturdy man of 42, father of 5, known for his unmatched knowledge of the forest trails. He could track a stag for 3 days without losing its trail. For a man like him to vanish without a trace seemed impossible. Brigadier Émile Fournier, head of the Saint-Dié gendarmerie, stood by the window of his office, watching the fine rain fall upon the cobblestones of the main street. At 53, after 30 years of service, he had seen accidents, crimes of passion, thefts, and drunken brawls, but this case disturbed him deeply. "Brigadier," called the young gendarme Lucien Dufour as he entered, his muddy boots leaving marks on the wooden floor. "Marchand's wife is here. She insists on speaking with you." Emile sighed and gestured for her to come in. Marie Marchand entered, her face pale and hollowed by sleepless nights. Her trembling hands clutched a damp shawl. "Brigadier Fournier," she began, her voice broken. "It's been 9 days now, 9 days without a word. Henry would never disappear like that. Something happened to him out there." "Madame Marchand," replied Emile, "we've already sent 2 search teams. The forest is vast, and with the recent rains—" "Not there," she interrupted, leaning forward, her eyes wild. "Not that part of the forest. No one goes there, you know that." A shiver ran down Emile's spine. He knew exactly what place she meant. North of Fres, beyond the stream of the dead, lay an area even the boldest woodcutters avoided. Not because of wolves or bears, those could be faced. No, this was something older, deeper, something that had lived there long before men. "The stories told about that place are just peasant superstitions," said Emile, but his voice lacked conviction. "My husband found something," Marie whispered, glancing around as if the walls could hear her. 3 days before he disappeared, he came home late. He was different, disturbed. He spoke of a house, an old stone house he'd never seen before, though he knew every inch of that forest. He said, a house covered in moss, surrounded by pines so thick that even in daylight it's dark as night. And he saw someone, a hooded figure watching him from a window before vanishing. Emile stood, walking toward the large map pinned to his wall. His finger traced the outline of the Vosges forest to the northern region near Fres. There indeed was a faint mark, a small cross drawn in faded ink, with no indication of what it meant. "Very well," he said finally. "I'll assemble a team. We leave at dawn." That night Emile could not sleep. He lay awake listening to the wind howl between the roofs of Saint Dié, remembering the stories he'd heard as a boy, tales of a family living beyond the stream of the dead. A family that never came to the village. Bought nothing, sold nothing, never attended church. A family whose members, people said, all looked the same, pale, silent, with eyes that reflected no light. His grandfather, before dying, had told him that at the beginning of the century, a priest had once tried to visit them, to bring them the word of God. He never returned. They found his cassock hanging from a branch near the stream, but not a single trace of his body. Emile turned in his bed, trying to chase away his thoughts. Tomorrow he would uncover the truth, whatever it might be. At dawn, under a sky heavy with gray clouds, Emile gathered his team in front of the gendarmerie. Besides Lucien, he had recruited 3 trusted men: Georges, a broad-shouldered former soldier; Thomas, a woodsman familiar with the region; and Dr. Anton Beaumont, whom Emile had insisted on bringing, sensing they might need medical expertise. "We're looking for Henry Marchand," Emile explained as the men checked their supplies and weapons. "But we'll also be investigating a possible dwelling in the northern sector. Stay together. Don't wander off. And if anything feels wrong, say it immediately." The group set off as the first pale rays of daylight barely touched the horizon. They walked for 3 hours through narrowing paths, crossing streams swollen by the autumn rains. The forest grew denser with every step, the trees older, their trunks covered in thick moss and lichens. "There's something different here," murmured Thomas, stopping near an ancient oak. "Look at the trees, no lumberjack marks, no signs of human passage. Not for decades, maybe longer." They finally reached the stream of the dead, a dark ribbon of water that looked almost black under the forest canopy. On the other side, the atmosphere changed instantly. The silence became suffocating. No birdsong. No rustle of animals. Even the wind seemed hesitant to enter this part of the woods. "There," said Georges suddenly, pointing ahead. Through the pines, barely visible in the morning mist, stood a stone house, exactly as Marie Marchand had described it. Covered in moss, shutters closed tight, and a chimney from which no smoke rose. But what froze the blood in Emile's veins was not the sight of the house. It was the feeling that the house itself was watching them. Patient, silent, like a beast waiting for its prey to come closer. "Stay alert," ordered Emile, drawing his revolver. They advanced slowly. The ground around the house was strangely bare. No grass, no weeds, only dark, compact earth. Bones littered the perimeter: deer, boar, and other creatures Emile couldn't immediately identify. Lucien approached the front door, a heavy slab of dark wood reinforced with wrought iron. He knocked 3 times. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then from inside came a sound. Not footsteps, but a faint scraping, like something, or someone, dragging itself slowly toward the door. "Who's there?" called Emile, his voice steady but firm. "National Gendarmerie, open this door." The scraping stopped. Then, very slowly, the door began to open. What they saw in the narrow gap made them all step back at once. In the darkness of the doorway stood a human figure, or rather, what had once been human. A man, perhaps, though his age was impossible to tell. His skin was a sickly, almost translucent white. His long, matted hair hung over bony shoulders. But what struck Emile most were his eyes, pale, glassy, lifeless, like those of a dead fish. What do you want?" The voice was hoarse, as if the man hadn't spoken in years. "We're looking for a missing man," said Emile, struggling to keep his composure. "Henry Marchand, a hunter. Have you seen him?" The creature, for it was hard to think of him as anything else, tilted his head slightly to the side, like a bird studying an insect. "No one comes here," he said at last. "No one must come here." "Sir, I'm Brigadier Fournier of the Saint-Dié Gendarmerie," Emile replied. "I have a duty to investigate this disappearance. May we come in?" The man didn't move right away. His eyes locked on Emile's with a disturbing intensity. Then slowly, he turned and vanished into the darkness of the house, leaving the door open behind him. Emile exchanged a glance with his men. Dr. Beaumont looked ghostly pale. Georges kept his hand on his weapon. Lucien looked ready to bolt at any second. "Stay close," ordered Emile as he stepped through the threshold. Inside, the air was worse than the outside. The smell hit them first, indescribable. A mixture of rot, sweat, dampness, and something far darker, something organic. The stone walls oozed moisture. The dim light filtering through the shutter cracks revealed a main room cluttered with decaying furniture. But what truly froze Emile's blood were the people. They were everywhere, sitting in the shadows, silent and motionless. Some on rickety chairs, others directly on the dirt floor. Men, women, children. They all shared the same cadaverous pallor, the same washed-out eyes, the same empty expression. How many of you are there?" asked Dr. Beaumont, his voice trembling. "We are the Roussels," replied a woman's voice from the darkness. A tall, gaunt figure rose to her feet, a woman with long gray hair cascading over a black dress. "We have always been here," she said softly. "We will always be here." Thomas the forester stepped closer to Emile and whispered, "Brigadier, look at their faces. Look carefully." Emile did, and suddenly he understood what had been disturbing him all along. They all looked alike, not merely as relatives might, but in a deeper, more unsettling way, as though all trace of genetic diversity had been erased, leaving behind an unnatural uniformity that defied the laws of nature itself. "How long have you lived here?" asked Emile. "Time does not exist in these woods," the woman replied, stepping forward. "My great-grandfather built this house in 1803. We have never left these lands. We've never needed to." "You never go to the village," Emile pressed. "You buy nothing, sell nothing." "We have everything we need here," she said calmly. "The forest provides us with food and game. We grow our vegetables, we weave our clothes, we are self-sufficient." Georges leaned in toward Emile and muttered, "Brigadier, I counted at least 20 people here, maybe more in the other rooms. How could an entire family live hidden like this for nearly a century?" It was a good question. Emile looked around, studying the house's layout. Several doors led to other rooms, and a stone staircase descended toward what must have been a cellar. "The hunter we're searching for," Emile insisted, turning back to the woman. "Henry Marchand, he passed through here about 10 days ago. Did you see him?" A heavy silence fell upon the room. The Roussels exchanged glances, if one could call them that, for their eyes seemed devoid of any true expression or communication. "No one comes here," the woman finally repeated. "No one should come here." "Madame, I must insist." A sudden sound cut him off, a muffled cry from somewhere above them. Every gendarme's eyes shot upward toward the blackened wooden beams of the ceiling. "What was that?" asked Lucian, his trembling hand hovering over his revolver. "Nothing," the woman replied quickly. "Just the children playing." But this time her voice betrayed something: fear, nervousness. Emile made his decision. "We need to search the house. If you have nothing to hide, you won't object." "You don't understand," said the man who had opened the door, stepping once more into the dim light. "There are things here, things that must remain hidden, not out of malice but out of necessity." "What kind of necessity?" asked Dr. Beaumont. "The necessity to preserve what we are," the man said, "what we have always been." Emile didn't wait for permission. He gestured for his men to begin the search. Georges and Thomas headed upstairs, while Lucian stayed below to keep an eye on the Roussels. Dr. Beaumont and Emile moved into the adjoining rooms. The first they inspected was a primitive kitchen, a soot-stained stone hearth, a few rusted utensils, shelves lined with clay pots and jars covered with cloth. But what caught Emile's attention was a journal lying open on a rickety table. He picked it up carefully. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. The entries dated back decades, the most recent from 1891, 3 years earlier. "Listen to this," Emile murmured, reading aloud to Dr. Beaumont. "April 15th, Marie has given birth to her fifth child by Jacques. The child is weak like the others. Father says it is God's will that we must remain pure, that outside blood is poison. But I see what this purity is doing to our children. I see their empty eyes, their frail bodies. How much longer can we go on like this?" "My God," whispered Beaumont, "do you understand what this means?" Before Emile could answer, a scream pierced the air. Not the laugh of children playing, but a cry of pure terror. It came from upstairs. Emile bolted toward the staircase, Beaumont close behind. They found Georges and Thomas frozen in front of an open door, their faces twisted in horror. "What did you find?" demanded Emile, rushing to them. Georges didn't answer. He simply pointed toward the room. It was a bedroom, or at least it had once been. But what they saw inside defied comprehension. In the dimness, they saw mattresses laid directly on the floor, and on those mattresses children. Perhaps 10 of them, of varying ages, but all sharing the same deformities, the same extreme frailty. Some had atrophied limbs, others skulls grotesquely enlarged or shrunken. Their eyes, when they turned toward the gendarmes stood frozen. Their eyes reflected no understanding, no trace of genuine awareness. Dr. Beaumont entered the room, his medical instinct momentarily overpowering his revulsion. He knelt beside one of the children, a little girl, no more than 7, and gently examined her face. "Inbreeding," he murmured. "Severe inbreeding through multiple generations. These children, they're the result of marriages between close relatives, very close." "How many generations?" Emile asked, though he dreaded the answer. "If what I see is correct, 4, perhaps 5. It's scientifically extraordinary and morally abominable." Suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed down the staircase. The gray-haired woman appeared in the doorway, followed by several other Roussels. "You had no right," she cried, her voice shattering the calm she had clung to until now. "You had no right to come here to see this." "Madame," Emile said, turning toward her, "what you've done, what your family has done for generations, is an abomination. These children need medical care. They must be taken to a safe place." "A safe place," she interrupted bitterly. You mean your orphanages, your asylums, so they can be put on display like monsters. They are home here. We care for them as we have always cared for our own. Why? Thomas's voice trembled with disbelief. Why would you do this? Why isolate yourselves? Why continue this lineage? The woman looked at them all. Her faded eyes glimmered suddenly with something new, a light no one had seen before, a mix of pride and madness. Because we are pure, she said simply. Because my great-grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Roussel, understood that the outside world was corrupt, poisoned by sin and decadence. He brought his family here to preserve them, to create a bloodline untouched by the stains of outsiders. And look at what that's created, said Dr. Beaumont, his voice filled with disgust. Sick children, weakened adults, an entire family condemned by its own arrogance. We survive, she replied coldly. We have survived for nearly a century. Our children are born, they grow, they have children of their own. The cycle continues. The cycle, Emile repeated. You mean to say that brothers and sisters, cousins? We do what must be done, she interrupted, her tone like ice. We have no choice. A wave of nausea rose in Emile's throat. He looked around the room, at the children lying still, at the pale adults gathered in the hallway. Now that he knew what to look for, he saw it everywhere. The subtle deformities, the identical features, the fragile structure of their bodies. And Henry Marchand, he suddenly demanded, what have you done with him? The silence that followed spoke louder than any confession. The gray-haired woman turned her gaze away. For the first time since their arrival, Emile saw a crack in her strange composure. Something else lived in her eyes now, guilt, perhaps, or resignation. He shouldn't have come here, she said at last, her voice almost a whisper. We told him to leave. We gave him a chance. Where is he? Emile's voice had turned to ice. What have you done to him? She didn't reply, but her eyes shifted involuntarily toward the floor. More precisely, toward the stone staircase Emile had noticed earlier, the one that led down into what could only be a cellar. George's Lucian with me, ordered Emile. Thomas, stay here with the doctor. Watch them. If anyone tries to escape, stop them. The three gendarmes descended the stone staircase, their oil lamps casting trembling shadows against the damp walls. The air grew colder with every step, heavier, thicker, and the same odor they had noticed upon entering the house now returned, stronger, concentrated. The cellar opened before them like the mouth of a beast. It was vast, far larger than the house above suggested. The vaulted walls were made of raw stone, and niches had been carved into them at various heights. Some contained jars, others held objects Emile couldn't identify in the gloom. My God, Lucian whispered, raising his lamp. Along the far wall, lined up like soldiers on parade, stood a series of coffins. Some were ancient, their wood decayed and collapsing. Others looked disturbingly recent. Emile counted quickly. There were at least 30. Their family cemetery, Georges muttered. They bury their dead down here. But that wasn't all. To the left side of the cellar stood what looked like a workbench, a massive wooden table, tools hanging on the wall, and buckets that had left dark, sticky stains across the stone floor. And tied to a chair beside that table, unconscious, but still breathing, was Henry Marchand. Henry, Emile rushed forward, Lucian close behind. The hunter's face was swollen, bruised. His clothes hung in tatters, his arms and legs streaked with dried blood. But he was alive. Untie him quickly, Emile ordered as Georges stood guard by the staircase, his weapon aimed upward. While Lucian worked to cut the ropes, Emile examined the cellar more closely. There was something else down here, something the Roussels had tried to hide. In the farthest, darkest corner, almost invisible, he noticed a low wooden door, sealed with a heavy padlock. "Brigadier," called Lucian. "He's waking up." Henry Marchand slowly opened his swollen eyes, blinking at the glare of the lamp. When he recognized Emile, a flicker of relief mixed with terror crossed his face. "Emile," he croaked, "you came. I thought I was going to die here." "What happened, Henry? How did you end up in this place?" Henry tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Lucian caught him and helped him sit on a wooden crate. "I found this house by accident about 2 weeks ago," Henry began, his voice still weak. "I was tracking a deer. It led me farther than usual. When I saw the house, I got curious. I knew no one was supposed to live here, but there was smoke coming from the chimney." "Go on," Emile urged. "I got closer and looked through a window. What I saw, it was like staring into another century. People dressed in rags, living like animals. But that wasn't the worst part." Henry stopped, his hands trembling at the memory. "I saw a tall, thin man dragging something behind the house. At first I thought it was a dead animal, but then I saw it was a body, a human body." Emile's heart began to pound. "A body whose?" "I don't know. It was wrapped in cloth, but I saw the feet, human feet, an adult's. He dragged it to some kind of shed and made it disappear inside." "And they discovered you?" "Not right away. I left, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. So I came back a few days later, at night this time. I wanted to see what they were doing with that body." Henry closed his eyes as if to drive away the images. "That was a mistake. They caught me looking through the cellar window. They dragged me inside and locked me down here." "What did they want from you?" Henry didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted toward the low door with the padlock, and Emile saw pure terror in his eyes. They wanted to know if anyone else knew about this place, if I'd told anyone. They questioned me for days, and then," his voice broke, "then they started talking about keeping me, making me one of them." "What?" Lucian's face went pale. "They said they needed new blood. Their children were becoming too weak and too sick. They wanted me to stay, to marry one of their daughters, to give them children, to continue their bloodline." A heavy silence filled the cellar. The horror of what Henry had just revealed went far beyond anything Emile had imagined. "That door," Henry whispered suddenly, pointing to the shadowed corner. "Don't open it, please, Brigadier, don't." But Emile was already moving. He approached the low door, drew his revolver, and aimed at the lock. The gunshot echoed through the cellar like thunder. The padlock shattered and clattered to the stone floor. "Brigadier, no," Henry shouted, but it was too late. Emile pulled the door open and raised his lamp to see inside. What he saw made him stagger backward in horror. The small room beyond was barely larger than a closet, and it was an ossuary. Human bones were piled from floor to ceiling. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all jumbled together in a grotesque heap. But these were not ancient, bleached remains. Some still bore traces of dried flesh, strands of hair, tattered clothing. And on a stone shelf arranged with meticulous care lay a collection of personal objects: watches, medals, cufflinks, a faded woman's hat. "The people who came here," murmured Georges behind Emile. "Over the decades, they all ended up here." Emile felt bile rise in his throat. He counted quickly, at least 15, maybe 20 skulls. Decades of murder, buried in silence beneath the forest. Then footsteps thundered down the stairs. Thomas appeared, breathless and panicked. "Brigadier, they're trying to escape. Dr. Beaumont is holding them off, but they're turning violent." Emile turned to Lucien. "Get Henry out of this house, now." "George is with me. It's time to end this horror." They rushed up the staircase and emerged into the main room, chaos erupting all around. The Roussels were frantic, some trying to reach the door, others huddled together like a terrified herd. Dr. Beaumont and Thomas blocked the exit, weapons raised. "Stop!" Emile roared, his voice leaving no room for defiance. "In the name of the law, you are all under arrest for murder and kidnapping." "You understand nothing," screamed the gray-haired woman, her voice shrill with fury. "We were protecting our family. Everyone who came here wanted to destroy us, to take us away, to drag us into your corrupted world. You killed innocent people," replied Emile. "Travelers, hunters, even a priest. How many? How many people have vanished in these woods because of you?" "They left us no choice," said the man who had opened the door for them. "When they discovered our existence, when they saw how we lived, they wanted to separate us. They wanted to take our children, to destroy our bloodline. We did what was necessary to survive." "By killing," Dr. Beaumont's voice trembled with fury, "by keeping your own children in a state of degeneration. Is that what you call survival?" A young man, no older than 20, suddenly stepped forward. Unlike the others, his eyes shone with a clarity no one had ever seen in the Roussel family. "Stop them," he said simply. "Please stop all of this. I don't want to live like this anymore." "Be quiet, Matthew," cried the old woman. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do, grandmother," replied the young man, his voice surprisingly firm. "I've read the old journals. I've seen what we've become. Each generation weaker than the last. Each child born with more difficulties. We're not surviving, we're dying slowly, trapped in our own madness." The journals. Emile remembered the notebook he had found in the kitchen. "There are more of them, aren't there?" Matthew nodded and walked toward a chest in the corner of the room. He opened it and pulled out a stack of yellow, dusty notebooks. "My great-great-grandfather documented everything," he explained, handing the books to Emile. "From the very beginning, since Jean-Baptiste Roussel brought his family here in 1803. Emile carefully opened the first notebook. The handwriting was neat and methodical, clearly that of an educated man who had taken care to record every detail. He began to read aloud. "September 3, 1803. We arrived today in what will be our new home, far from Paris, far from the corruption that has destroyed France. Here, in these isolated mountains, we will preserve the purity of our blood, the nobility of our lineage. My wife, Anne-Marie, and our 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, are all I need to create a new dynasty, untainted by revolutionaries and commoners." "He was a nobleman," murmured Dr. Beaumont, "an aristocrat who fled the revolution." Emile continued flipping through the journals, skipping through the years, observing the steady descent into madness. 1815. Anne-Marie died giving birth to our 13th child. The baby did not survive either, but we still have 8 healthy children. Francois, my eldest son, will marry his sister Marguerite in the spring. It is God's will that we remain pure. 1827. The children of Francois and Marguerite show signs of weakness. 3 have died in infancy. The doctor I brought from Saint-Dié, whom I later had to eliminate to protect our secret, spoke of inbreeding, of danger, but he did not understand our divine mission. 1841. The third generation has been born. Some children are different. Their bodies do not develop properly, but we persevere. We must persevere. Emile closed the notebook, unable to continue. Nearly a century of methodical madness, documented with terrifying precision. How many, he asked, turning to the gray-haired woman. How many of you are still alive? She answered in a hollow voice. All defiance had drained from her. 23 members of the Roussel family, across 4 living generations. The others are below in their coffins. And the people you killed. She didn't answer, but Matthew did. From what I've pieced together from the journals and the items kept in the cellar, at least 10 people over the decades. Maybe more. The elders didn't record everything. Lives, innocent lives, lost simply for crossing paths with this cursed family. Hunters, travelers, a priest, perhaps even gendarmes who came to investigate earlier disappearances. You're all coming with us, declared Emile firmly. The adults will stand trial for their crimes. The children will be taken to institutions that can care for them properly. No. The woman suddenly lunged toward Emile, her skeletal hands clawing like talons. You can't separate us. We're a family, it's all we have. George intercepted her and held her firmly. She struggled for a moment, then collapsed in tears, the first sign of human emotion they had seen in any of the Roussels. A family, Dr. Beaumont repeated bitterly. You created a prison of blood and madness from which none of you could ever escape. The rest of the day passed in a blur of grim activity. Emile sent Thomas to fetch reinforcements from Saint-Dié. Meanwhile, he and his men began the gruesome task of documenting the scene, photographing the house, the sick children, the cellar, and its horrifying ossuary. Matthew proved to be a valuable ally. Unlike the others, he seemed to possess a remarkable clarity of mind, perhaps because he was of the youngest generation and had access to the old writings. How did you learn to read? Asked Emile as they waited for reinforcements. My grandfather taught me, replied Matthew. He was one of the few who doubted. He showed me the books Jean-Baptiste had brought from Paris. He wanted me to understand that there was a world beyond these woods. Then why didn't you leave? Matthew looked around the dark house at his broken family. Where could I have gone? I am a Roussel. My face, my body, everything about me bears the mark of what we are. Who would ever accept me in your world? It was a question Emile could not answer. The arrival of reinforcements from Saint-Dié, along with several gendarmes from Gérardmer and Épinal, turned the once silent forest into a scene of controlled chaos. It took 3 wagons to carry all the members of the Roussel family out of the woods. The most fragile children were laid on improvised stretchers, wrapped in blankets brought by the officers. The journey back to Saint-Dié took almost the entire night. The Roussels walked in silence, like specters torn from their natural habitat. Some wept softly, others seemed completely detached from reality, their faded eyes staring into nothingness. The gray-haired woman, whom Emile had learned was named Marguerite Roussel, kept glancing back toward the forest, as if hoping to catch one last glimpse of their home. When the strange procession finally emerged from the trees and entered the cobbled streets of Saint-Dié, the sun was rising over the slate rooftops. The townsfolk, awakened by the noise, stepped out of their homes to witness the scene with a mix of curiosity and horror. News spreads quickly in a small town. Within hours, everyone knew that an entire family had been discovered living deep in the forest, a family that had killed innocents and survived in unimaginable conditions for nearly a century. "Look at them," whispered a woman on the sidewalk, crossing herself. "Creatures of the devil." "No," replied a man beside her. "They're just people who live too long in the shadows." The Roussels were temporarily placed in the local gendarmerie cells and nearby buildings. Dr. Beaumont, assisted by two other physicians from Saint-Cyr, immediately began examining every member of the family, paying particular attention to the children. Henry Marchand, after receiving medical care, was reunited with his wife and children. His physical wounds would heal, but Emile knew that the mental scars would remain far longer. 2 days later, the prefect of the Vosges, Paul Charpentier, arrived from Epinal. He was a tall, imposing man of 58, with a neatly groomed gray mustache and eyes that had seen much over the course of his career. Yet even he seemed shaken by what Emile revealed to him. "A century," he repeated in disbelief, sitting in Emile's office with the journals of Jean-Baptiste Roussel laid open before him. "An entire family hidden for a century. How is that even possible?" "The woods, Monsieur le Préfet," replied Emile. "There are areas even the loggers never go. And this family, they did everything they could to remain invisible. They never traded with anyone, never sought help, and eliminated anyone who discovered their existence. And now we have to decide what to do with them." Charpentier rubbed his forehead wearily. "Technically, they're all accomplices to murder. But how do you judge children who know nothing else but this life? How do you judge adults who were raised to believe that this was the only way to survive?" It was the same question that had haunted Emile since their discovery. The law was clear about murder, but this case defied every simple classification. Dr. Beaumont entered the office, looking exhausted. He had spent the last 2 days examining each member of the Roussel family in meticulous detail. "I've completed my assessment," he announced, placing a thick file on the desk. "The results are devastating." "Tell us," said Charpentier. "Of the 23 surviving Roussels," Beaumont began, "only 5 can be considered relatively healthy, and even they show signs of long-term inbreeding. The other 18 suffer from various afflictions, physical deformities, mental deficiencies, heart defects, chronic lung diseases." He opened the folder and pulled out several photographs. "These children in particular, some will likely never reach adulthood. Their immune systems are so weakened that even a minor illness could be fatal." "Can they be treated?" asked Emile. "Treated, perhaps partially," Beaumont replied. "But genetic damage cannot be repaired. These children will bear the consequences of their ancestors' choices for the rest of their lives." A heavy silence fell over the office. Charpentier looked at the photographs with an expression of profound sadness. Then, quietly, he asked the question that hung over them all. "How are they?" "That's where things become even more complicated," replied Beaumont. "Many of them, especially the youngest, show signs of what we would call limited intellectual development, but I'm not convinced it's entirely due to inbreeding. They were never educated, never exposed to the outside world, never intellectually stimulated. They live in an almost primitive state." "And the older adults, the ones who took part in the murders?" Beaumont hesitated. "That's harder to assess. They certainly understand what death is, what it means to kill, but their moral framework is completely different from ours. To them, protecting the family was the supreme law, the only law that mattered." "That doesn't excuse them," said Charpentier firmly. "People died. Families mourned their missing for decades." I'm not trying to excuse them, Monsieur le Préfet, Beaumont replied. I'm only trying to give you all the information you need to make a fair decision. Emile stood and walked to the window. Down in the street below, a crowd had gathered in front of the gendarmerie. Some waved placards, others shouted slogans he couldn't quite make out. The people want blood, he observed quietly. They want to see the Roussels punished for their crimes. And they're right to want that, said Charpentier. But we must act according to the law, not the anger of the mob. Over the following weeks, the trial of the Roussels became the most publicized event the Vosges had ever seen. Journalists poured in from Paris, Strasbourg, even Belgium and Germany. The story of a family that had lived hidden for a century, practicing inbreeding and killing to protect their secret, was too extraordinary to ignore. The trial took place in the Grand Hall of the Saint-Dié courthouse, a vast chamber with a high ceiling and oak-paneled walls. Judge Antonin Mercier, a 65-year-old man known for his wisdom and fairness, presided. 8 adult Roussels, those over 21, sat side by side on the defendant's bench. Marguerite Roussel, the matriarch, stood tall despite her age. Dr. Beaumont estimated her to be around 70. The others sat with heads bowed, overwhelmed by the harsh lights and the stares of hundreds of strangers. The prosecutor, Maître Auguste Renard, was a meticulous man who presented his case with surgical precision. He listed every known disappearance over the decades, presented the personal items found in the cellar as evidence, and called Henry Marchand to testify about his kidnapping and imprisonment. These people, Renard declared, pointing at the accused, created their own law in the woods, a law that placed their survival above all human morality. They killed without remorse, buried without ceremony, and continued their lives as if their victims had never existed. The defense attorney, Maître Julien Fournier, no relation to Brigadier Emile, had agreed to represent the Roussels mostly because no one else would. He was a young, idealistic man who believed that even the worst accused deserved a fair defense. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began during his closing statement, "I am not here to deny the facts. People died, and my clients are responsible, but I ask you to consider the context in which these acts were committed." He turned toward the Roussels. "Look at them, truly look. They are not monsters born with a desire to kill. They are victims, victims of a delusional ideology born nearly a century ago from a man who fled the French Revolution. They were born into this system, raised in it, conditioned to believe that the outside world was an existential threat." Fournier then called Matthew to the stand. The young man, now dressed in clean clothes provided by the authorities, looked transformed, more present, more aware. "Matthew," Fournier asked gently, "can you tell us what your childhood was like?" "I didn't know it was abnormal," Matthew answered clearly. "For me, it was simply life. We worked together, ate together, prayed together. The elders told us the outside world was dangerous, that it would destroy our family if we ever let it in. And when someone from the outside world discovered your existence..." Matthew lowered his eyes. "The elders said we had no choice, that it was them or us. I didn't truly understand what that meant when I was little, but as I grew older, when I started reading the old journals, I began to doubt." "Doubt?" Fournier asked. "Doubt what?" "Everything," said Matthew. "Our right to live that way. Our right to take another person's life to protect our secret. The so-called wisdom of our ancestors who had trapped us in that existence." Matthew's testimony was the most poignant moment of the entire trial. Several jurors wiped away tears. Even Judge Mercier paused, visibly shaken. He seemed moved, but the decisive moment came when Marguerite Roussel herself took the stand. Unlike the other defendants, she refused to be intimidated by the court. "I regret nothing," she declared, her voice firm and echoing through the hushed courtroom. "We did what was necessary to survive. My great-grandfather gave us a mission, to preserve our bloodline to remain pure in a corrupt world. We honored that mission, even at the cost of innocent lives." "Innocent lives?" the prosecutor demanded. "Innocent," she repeated, laughing harshly. "Those people came onto our land, spied on our family, threatened our very existence. What were we supposed to do? Let them destroy us?" "You could have left," Judge Mercier intervened. "You could have sought help, joined society, lived like everyone else." Marguerite looked at him with contempt. "Live in your filthy cities, work in your factories, lose our identity in your masses. No, we chose the dignity of isolation." "You call that dignity?" the judge shot back, gesturing toward the photographs displayed as evidence, the pale, sickly children born of generations of inbreeding. "Look at what your so-called dignity has created. Sick children, weakened adults, an entire family condemned by its own arrogance." For the first time, Marguerite seemed shaken. Her eyes lingered on the photographs, and something flickered across her face, pain, perhaps, or regret. "We did what was necessary," she repeated softly, but her voice had lost its strength. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they finally returned, the verdict was clear: guilty. All 8 defendants were convicted of premeditated murder. However, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances, Judge Mercier issued varied sentences. Marguerite Roussel, as matriarch and leader, was sentenced to life imprisonment. The 3 other oldest defendants received 20 to 30 years in prison. The youngest adults, several barely over 21, received 10 to 15 years, with the possibility of parole. Children and adolescents under 21 were placed under state guardianship. The most ill were sent to specialized medical institutions. The others, including Matthew, were entrusted to foster families or orphanages, where authorities hoped they could learn to live in the modern world. 3 years passed after the trial. Saint-Dié had returned to its usual calm, though the story of the Roussels still haunted conversations in taverns during long winter evenings. The house in the woods had been demolished by order of the prefect, its stones scattered, its site now just a clearing slowly reclaimed by nature. Émile Fournier, now 56 years old, sat in his gendarmerie office one rainy October afternoon in 1897. He was leafing through a Paris newspaper that featured a long article about the Roussels, analyzing their case from sociological and anthropological angles. Academics debated the implications of their story. Moralists lectured about human nature. Scientists studied the effects of prolonged inbreeding. But for Émile, those were only words. He remembered the faces, the washed-out eyes of the children, the trembling hands of Marguerite, and the look of relief mixed with terror on Henry Marchand's face when he had found him in that dark cellar. A light knock came at the door. "Come in," he said, looking up. Matthew Roussel entered the room. He was almost unrecognizable from the pale, emaciated young man Émile had met in the forest house. He wore a simple but clean suit. His hair was neatly combed, and there was a spark in his eyes that had never been there before. "Brigadier Fournier," said Matthew, extending his hand. "I came to thank you." "Thank me?" Emile asked, shaking his hand, surprised by the firmness of his grip. "For what?" "For freeing us." Matthew sat down across from him. "I know that might sound strange. You arrested my family, sent my grandparents and uncles to prison, but you also saved us from an existence that would have slowly but surely killed us all." Emile studied the young man. "How are you, Matthew? How are you adapting?" "With difficulty," Matthew admitted. "The first weeks were terrifying. So many people, so much noise, so much light. I'd wake up at night thinking I was still in the woods, that all of this was just a dream. But my foster family, Monsieur and Madame Dubois of Gérardmer, have been patient with me. And your education." A smile crossed Matthew's face. "I'm learning fast. My tutor says I now read at a high school level. I study history, science, literature. It's like discovering an entire world that existed right beside us, but that we were never part of. And the others, your brothers, sisters, cousins." Matthew's smile faded. "It's harder for them. Some of the youngest are adapting well. They were. They were young enough that their conditioning hadn't yet taken full hold. But the older adolescents, many of them struggle. They're afraid of the outside world, of strangers, of change. Some are in specialized institutions that help them learn the most basic social skills." "And the sick children?" Emile asked quietly. Matthew lowered his eyes. "3 of them died last year. Dr. Beaumont said their bodies were simply too weak. The others, they're receiving the best care possible." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "But their lives will be short and difficult. That's the legacy our ancestors left them." Emile felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. "Have you heard from your grandmother?" he asked. "I visited grandmother Marguerite 2 months ago. She's in the prison at Nancy." Matthew looked out the window, watching the rain slide down the rooftops of Saint-Dié. "She's aged so much. Her body is frail, but her spirit remains as rigid as ever. She still refuses to admit she was wrong. She says we betrayed the family, that we abandoned our sacred mission." "And what did you tell her?" Emile asked. "I told her the real betrayal was what she did to her own children. That preserving a bloodline means nothing if that bloodline is condemned to suffering and decay." Matthew turned back toward Emile, his eyes shining with emotion. "She cried. It was the first time I had ever seen her cry. I think deep down she knows. She knows it was all a terrible mistake." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the steady drumming of rain against the windows. "Why have you really come to see me today, Matthew?" Emile finally asked. The young man reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope on the desk. "I've been accepted to the University of Strasbourg," he said with quiet pride. "I'm going to study medicine. I want to become a doctor like Dr. Beaumont. I want to help people who suffer from genetic diseases, who carry the weight of their ancestors' mistakes." Emile opened the envelope and read the acceptance letter. A smile spread across his face. "That's remarkable, Matthew, truly remarkable. Of all the things that came out of that terrible story, your success is the brightest of them all." "It's because of you," insisted Matthew. "If you hadn't come that day, if you hadn't had the courage to go down into that cellar to face my family, I'd still be out there in the woods, trapped in the same endless cycle of suffering." Emile rose from his chair and walked around the desk. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You did the hardest part yourself, Matthew. You chose to see the truth, to accept it, and to build something new from the ruins. That takes a courage few men possess. Matthew stood too, and for a moment the two men stood there, separated by decades of age and worlds of experience, yet united by the memory of what they had found deep in the forests of the Vosges. "There's one thing I wanted to ask you," said Matthew. "Why do you think my great-great-grandfather did it? Why did Jean-Baptiste Roussel really take his family into those woods?" Emile thought for a long moment before answering. "I've wondered that myself over the years. I've read his journals more than once trying to understand his mind. I think, at first, it was fear. The revolution had destroyed his world, the social order he believed in. He fled into the mountains to escape the chaos. But that doesn't explain why he chose total isolation," objected Matthew. "No," admitted Emile. "I think something else happened in those early years. Maybe he tried to integrate with the local villagers and was rejected because of his noble origins. Maybe he saw his children growing up and feared they might marry commoners, diluting the aristocratic blood he prized so much. Whatever the reason, his fear turned into obsession, and that obsession into madness. And that madness passed from generation to generation," murmured Matthew. "That's how madness often works," replied Emile. "It doesn't strike all at once. It creeps in slowly, becomes normal, until no one remembers what normal even was. Each generation inherits a little more of that distorted reality until the truth is lost entirely." Matthew nodded slowly. "That's why I want to study medicine, not just to heal bodies, but to understand how these patterns form, how they're passed down, and most of all, how to break them." "You'll break the pattern simply by living differently," said Emile gently, "by choosing light over shadow." After Matthew left, Emile returned to his desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a thick folder, his personal file on the Roussel case, filled with notes, photographs, and years of reflections. He opened it to the last page, where he had begun writing a final report for the prefect, one that would never be officially submitted, but that helped him to organize his own thoughts. He picked up his pen and began to write. What happened in the forest of the Vosges is not merely a story of isolation or inbreeding. It is a lesson in what happens when human beings completely sever themselves from their own humanity, when they place an abstract idea, such as the purity of blood or the preservation of a lineage, above the real well-being of the very people they claim to protect. Jean-Baptiste Roussel did not create a utopia. He created a prison. He built walls not from stone, but from fear and ideology. And those walls tightened with each generation, slowly suffocating the very life they were meant to preserve. The victims of this story are not only the 18 people who disappeared over the decades. They are also the Roussels themselves, 4 generations of children born into a system they did not choose, conditioned to perpetuate a cycle of suffering they could never understand. Emile stopped writing and looked out the window. The rain had stopped, and a beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the wet rooftops of Saint-Dié. He thought of Henry Marchand, who had finally managed to rebuild a normal life with his family, though he still refused to go hunting in the northern forests. He thought of the Roussel children, scattered across orphanages and institutions throughout the Vosges, some adapting, others struggling, all carrying the weight of a past they did not create. And he thought of Marguerite, growing old in her prison cell in Nancy, still clinging to the ideology that had destroyed her family. A knock sounded at the door. Lucien Dufour, now an experienced gendarme in his 30s, entered with a stack of documents. "Brigadier, have you heard the news?" he asked. What news? The Parliament in Paris is debating a new law. They want to forbid marriages between first cousins and make it mandatory to register all marriages with the civil authorities. They're citing the Roussel case as one of the main reasons. Emile nodded slowly. At least something good will come out of this tragedy. There's something else, added Lucien hesitantly. Journalists have asked to interview you. They're writing a book about the case. They want your version of the story. My version, Emile thought for a moment. No, I believe I've said everything I had to say in the official reports. This story now belongs to the Roussels themselves, to the survivors who must find a way to live with that legacy. Lucien seemed relieved. He hated the constant media attention surrounding the case as much as Emile did. How's your family, Lucien? Emile asked, deliberately changing the subject. Good, Brigadier. My wife is expecting our second child in January. That's wonderful, congratulations. After Lucien left, Emile placed the Roussel file back into his drawer. It was time to let the story rest, at least for a while. There were other cases to handle, other responsibilities requiring his attention. But deep down, he knew the Roussel affair would never truly leave him. It was the kind of story that carves itself into your soul, that changes the way you see the world forever. A few weeks later, on a cold November morning, Emile received a telegram from the prison in Nancy. Marguerite Roussel had died in her sleep. She was 80 years old. He arranged for Matthew to be informed. The young man, now studying in Strasbourg, sent a brief reply. I will come for the funeral. She deserves at least that. The funeral was a quiet affair. Only Matthew, two of his cousins who had recovered enough to travel, Dr. Beaumont and Emile attended. Marguerite was buried in the cemetery of Saint-Dié, far from the woods where she had spent most of her life. As the priest recited the prayers, Emile watched Matthew. The young man was crying silently, tears streaming freely down his cheeks, a striking contrast to the emotionless boy Emile had first met in that house deep in the forest. After the ceremony, as the others drifted away, Matthew lingered near the grave. Emile approached and stood beside him in silence. You know what's saddest of all, Matthew finally said. She died still believing she was right. Until the end, she thought we were the ones who had betrayed the family. Maybe some part of her knew the truth, Emile suggested. Maybe she simply couldn't admit it. To acknowledge her mistake would mean recognizing that her whole life, all her choices, all the suffering she caused and endured, had been for nothing. That's a terrifying thought, murmured Matthew. That's why so many people cling to their mistakes, replied Emile. To admit we were wrong is to face the full weight of our errors. Sometimes, it's easier to keep living inside the illusion. Matthew wiped his eyes and turned to face him. I won't make that mistake, he said firmly. I'll face the truth no matter how painful it is. That truth itself, and I will use it to build something better. I don't doubt that, said Emile with a gentle smile. As they left the cemetery together, Emile felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time when thinking about the Roussel affair, a feeling of hope. Despite all the horror, despite all the suffering, something good had emerged from the ruins. The years went by. In 1902, Emile retired from the gendarmerie after 35 years of service. He settled in a small house on the outskirts of Saint-Dié, where he spent his days gardening, reading, and occasionally writing short articles for the local newspaper. Matthew completed his medical studies with distinction and opened a practice in Strasbourg, specializing in hereditary diseases. He married a schoolteacher named Claire, and together they had 3 healthy children. Other members of the Roussel family also found their way into the world. Some became farmers, others craftsmen, and a few joined the army. Many changed their names, trying to escape the stigma of their family's history. The sickest children met darker fates. Most died before reaching adulthood, their bodies too frail to endure life's hardships. Yet even in their short lives, they received more love and care than they had ever known in the old forest house. Years later, when Emile was 70, he received an unexpected visit. Matthew arrived with his wife and their 3 children on a bright Sunday afternoon. "Dr. Roussel," said Emile warmly, welcoming them into his garden. "What a wonderful surprise." "Please call me Matthew," the doctor replied with a smile. "And this is my wife Claire and our children Louise, Paul, and little Jean." Emile looked at the children, healthy, bright-eyed, and full of life. It was hard to believe they carried the blood of the Roussels. "They're beautiful," he said sincerely. While the children played in the garden under Claire's watchful eye, Matthew and Emile sat together on a bench beneath an old oak tree. "I wanted you to meet them," said Matthew. "I wanted you to see that the cycle is truly broken. My children will grow up in the light, not in the shadows. They will know the world. They will love freely. They will live fully." "Will you tell them where they come from?" asked Emile. "When they're old enough to understand," replied Matthew. "I don't want them to grow up with lies, but I'll also teach them that we are not defined by the mistakes of our ancestors. We are defined by our own choices, by how we choose to live our lives." Emile watched the children running through the garden, their laughter filling the air. Little Jean, no more than 4 years old, picked a flower and ran to his father, his face glowing with joy. "For you, Papa," he said, holding out the flower. Matthew took it and lifted his son into his arms, kissing him gently on the forehead. It was such a simple, ordinary gesture, yet for someone who knew the history of the Roussel family, it was extraordinary. It was an act of pure love, untouched by ideology or fear, just a father loving his child. "You know," Emile said softly, "I often think back to that day in 1894 when we found the house. Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing. We destroyed a family, sent people to prison, separated children from their parents." "You did the only thing possible," said Matthew firmly. "That family was already destroyed, Brigadier. It had been destroying itself slowly for almost a century. You didn't cause that destruction, you simply ended it." "But the cost," Emile murmured. "The cost of doing nothing would have been far greater," Matthew said, looking at him with deep conviction. "One more generation, maybe 2, and there would have been no Roussels left. The inbreeding would have killed us all. Instead, look," he gestured toward his children. "Life goes on. Real life, not the ghostly existence we had in the woods." The sun was slowly sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Claire called the children for dinner, and the little family prepared to leave. "Thank you," said Matthew, shaking Emile's hand. "Thank you for everything, not just for solving the case, but for believing that we could become more than our past." After they left, Emile remained sitting in his garden until the first stars appeared in the night sky. He thought of the dense forest where the old house no longer stood, where nature had reclaimed the clearing that had once been the stage of so much suffering. He thought of the victims, The 10 people whose names were now engraved on a memorial plaque in the Church of Saint Dié. Lives cut short by fear and isolation. But he also thought of the survivors, of Matthew and his children, and of the other young Roussels who had found their place in the world. They were proof that truth itself, and I will use it to build something better. I don't doubt that, said Emile with a gentle smile. As they left the cemetery together, Emile felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time when thinking about the Roussel affair, a feeling of hope. Despite all the horror, despite all the suffering, something good had emerged from the ruins. The years went by. In 1902, Emile retired from the gendarmerie after 35 years of service. He settled in a small house on the outskirts of Saint-Dié, where he spent his days gardening, reading, and occasionally writing short articles for the local newspaper. Matthew completed his medical studies with distinction and opened a practice in Strasbourg, specializing in hereditary diseases. He married a schoolteacher named Claire, and together they had 3 healthy children. Other members of the Roussel family also found their way into the world. Some became farmers, others craftsmen, and a few joined the army. Many changed their names, trying to escape the stigma of their family's history. The sickest children met darker fates. Most died before reaching adulthood, their bodies too frail to endure life's hardships. Yet even in their short lives, they received more love and care than they had ever known in the old forest house. Years later, when Emile was 70, he received an unexpected visit. Matthew arrived with his wife and their 3 children on a bright Sunday afternoon. "Dr. Roussel," said Emile warmly, welcoming them into his garden. "What a wonderful surprise." "Please call me Matthew," the doctor replied with a smile. "And this is my wife Claire and our children Louise, Paul, and little Jean." Emile looked at the children, healthy, bright-eyed, and full of life. It was hard to believe they carried the blood of the Roussels. "They're beautiful," he said sincerely. While the children played in the garden under Claire's watchful eye, Matthew and Emile sat together on a bench beneath an old oak tree. "I wanted you to meet them," said Matthew. "I wanted you to see that the cycle is truly broken. My children will grow up in the light, not in the shadows. They will know the world. They will love freely. They will live fully." "Will you tell them where they come from?" asked Emile. "When they're old enough to understand," replied Matthew. "I don't want them to grow up with lies, but I'll also teach them that we are not defined by the mistakes of our ancestors. We are defined by our own choices, by how we choose to live our lives." Emile watched the children running through the garden, their laughter filling the air. Little Jean, no more than 4 years old, picked a flower and ran to his father, his face glowing with joy. "For you, Papa," he said, holding out the flower. Matthew took it and lifted his son into his arms, kissing him gently on the forehead. It was such a simple, ordinary gesture, yet for someone who knew the history of the Roussel family, it was extraordinary. It was an act of pure love, untouched by ideology or fear, just a father loving his child. "You know," Emile said softly, "I often think back to that day in 1894 when we found the house. Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing. We destroyed a family, sent people to prison, separated children from their parents." "You did the only thing possible," said Matthew firmly. "That family was already destroyed, Brigadier. It had been destroying itself slowly for almost a century. You didn't cause that destruction, you simply ended it." "But the cost," Emile murmured. The cost of doing nothing would have been far greater, Matthew said, looking at him with deep conviction. One more generation, maybe two, and there would have been no Rousels left. The inbreeding would have killed us all. Instead, look, he gestured toward his children. Life goes on. Real life, not the ghostly existence we had in the woods. The sun was slowly sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Claire called the children for dinner, and the little family prepared to leave. "Thank you," said Matthew, shaking Emile's hand. "Thank you for everything, not just for solving the case, but for believing that we could become more than our past." After they left, Emile remained sitting in his garden until the first stars appeared in the night sky. He thought of the dense forest where the old house no longer stood, where nature had reclaimed the clearing that had once been the stage of so much suffering. He thought of the victims, the 10 people whose names were now engraved on a memorial plaque in the church of Saint Dié. Lives cut short by fear and isolation. But he also thought of the survivors, of Matthew and his children, and of the other young Rousels who had found their place in the world. They were proof that,